Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with part two of our Haydn Symphony Crusade. That's part two out of like 107 parts. We'll see how many we actually get through. Hopefully all of them. Part two, of course, is devoted to Symphony No. 2. And Symphony No. 2 is an extraordinary work. It is. And I can't stress enough. I just can't. There is no immature Haydn when it comes to the symphonies. He was nearly 30 when he wrote his first symphony, already an exceptionally experienced composer. And Symphony No. 2 really shows that. It's probably the shortest of all the Haydn symphonies. It plays for less than 10 minutes. In three movements, fast, slow, fast. But those three movements are extraordinary. And the piece itself is extraordinary. It shows Haydn already working with concepts, musical concepts and ideas that would characterize all of his future work. And it's not because he's anticipating it. It's because he's already there. Now, he's working within the style of music as he found it in the late 1750s and early 1760s. And the language of music would soon become immeasurably enlarged in his own hands. He was the one who did it. But at the moment, he's working with the tools that have been offered to him. And he's doing it in such an exceptional and an imaginative way, because Symphony No. 2 is really special. It's a very special piece. And we're going to talk about what makes it special. But it's essentially, this is the only Haydn symphony, the only one that has no sectional repeats at all. It is entirely through composed. And that's remarkable. I mean, you wouldn't think it's remarkable. I mean, would we care whether it has a repeat or doesn't have a repeat? Everything back then had repeats. Most forms were binary. Okay, that was the cat. Most forms were binary. That is, they had two sections, both repeated, unless it was an ABA, like a minuet, for example, that has, a middle section with the outer sections repeated. But within those outer sections, you would have two sections, both repeated. I mean, this was a very, very typical formal organization. No matter what happened within, what type of outward obvious form the piece had, it would have internal repeats. Haydn's Second Symphony has no internal repeats. That means it's basically through composed. Through composed means it starts at point A, it ends at point B, and it goes all the way through, plays straight through. So the emphasis in this symphony is always on development, on the ongoing working with the thematic material and the fact that it's never exactly the same. This is a critical, essential, I can't stress strongly enough, cosmically important principle in Haydn's work, and it would become just as important for Mozart and especially for Beethoven. The idea that music is a constantly evolving, dynamic, dramatic narrative. And it's in this teeny tiny little Second Symphony where Haydn first makes that point extremely clearly and eloquently. But he's facing a double problem, because while it's perfectly fine to say, I'm going to write a piece that has no literal repeats, of course, themes come back, but they never come back exactly the same. They're transformed as they come back. And each movement has a slightly different form in which that principle is followed. But that means you have to deal with the question of larger formal coherence. In other words, why do these three movements belong to this symphony and to no other symphony? How do you somehow give the feeling that these three movements belong together and they're not just three random pieces that somehow fell into a clump and the composer called it Symphony No. 2? Well, Haydn addresses that issue too, and he does it in a marvelous way. What he does, it's really very simple. It's so simple, it's so childish that nobody even notices what he does. All three movements feature major ideas. All three movements, their main ideas, are all united by the extensive use of trills. Now, you know what a trill is, right? It's when you take two notes and you alternate between them very quickly. That's a trill, right? Just that simple alternating between two notes. It's an ornament. It's not a theme. It's not a tune. It's just a sound. It's a musical sound. But that musical sound is the most prominent musical sound in the entire symphony and in every single one of its movements. And so for that reason alone, you get a sense as you're listening to the whole symphony, because you hear these successions of trills in all of the thematic material, that somehow it's all one piece. And it works so well. And it is astonishing how little musicology and people who listen to these things and analysts talk about just the sheer use of sound, of texture as a legitimate thematic idea in its own right that unites an entire work. There are actually even very few composers who understood how to work with music that way. Really, the next one who got it as well as Haydn did was probably Mahler. And I'm not kidding. It was something that it took years and years and years to sink into the musical consciousness. You know, I can give you a very simple example if you know your Mahler. Sleigh bells in the Fourth Symphony. That's a musical sound. And because Mahler has sleigh bells in the first movement and sleigh bells in the last movement, you know these two pieces belong to the same family, even if they don't necessarily share themes. That's the kind of thing, unifying a work simply by use of sound and texture or rhythm. And Haydn knew that. Haydn knew it from the very beginning. And it's one of the things that makes him so remarkable, and one of the reasons that his music has been so unappreciated, because most people don't even get it. They want to hear a tune, and they think two things aren't related unless they have the same tune. That's nonsense. The first thing you have to understand when listening to Haydn is that musical ideas can be anything as long as they make noise or not. Even silence is a musical idea in context, and Haydn uses all of them. Every single thing that music can do, he will use, and he'll use it as a unifying principle. And so I'm going to play you a lot of this symphony because it's only 9 minutes long. I want you first to hear the exposition of the first movement. Now, the first movement, because it has no internal repeats, normally sonata form movements, as we've discussed and as you know, have an exposition which gets repeated, and then a development and a recapitulation, which sometimes gets repeated, but most often people don't do second half repeats because it just makes things longer. You know, what happens then is that it essentially divides the movement into two pieces, exposition and then development, recapitulation, two separate blocks, right? And the first one is repeated. But in this particular case, because there are no repeats, you really, really get the fact that you're dealing with exposition, development, recapitulation. And to make it even more clear, what Haydn has done is he has made sure that in this little 4-minute movement, every single section is almost exactly the same length within a couple of seconds. What that means is that you have a minute and 20 seconds followed by another minute and 20 seconds followed by another minute and 20 seconds. Maybe it's a minute and 15 seconds. I mean, there's maybe a few seconds difference between them because the music is never quite the same. So that means that some bits will be shorter and some bits longer. But what's remarkable is how beautifully balanced this movement is. So on the one hand, again, you have this continual development, themes and motives that always return, but never quite exactly the same. But at the same time, the larger formal organization is perfectly balanced. I mean, perfectly balanced. So anyway, let me play you the exposition, and then I can turn you loose on the whole symphony. Once again, we have Patrick Galois with Sinfonia Finlandia on Naxos. So here is the first movement exposition, and I'll indicate a few highlights along the way, such as the trills and the second subject, which is a beautiful theme in a minor key. Here they are. Just listen for yourself. beautiful, wasn't it? And as you can see, I indicated the most prominent motive that uses trills, but they occur before then. They permeate the first subject. And so you see, I mean, essentially a perfectly balanced movement with three identically equal sections. And that is really significant because in throwing the emphasis on development, on working with the music, Haydn establishes the procedure that's going to characterize the music for the rest of his life, basically. And that's what made him stand out from what other composers were doing. I mean, it really does, because in most symphonies of this period, development sections tend to be teeny tiny, very, very short. They're mostly like all exposition, then a little sort of middle section that brings you back to the exposition and for the recapitulation, and you hear it all again. And that's it. There's not a lot of working out going on. But because Haydn was such a highly developmental composer, a guy who was so allergic to literal repetition, that is what allowed him to expand the language of music, to give himself more room in which to work and to create ideas that were capable of being changed and developed. I mean, they develop. So that's the thing I think to keep in mind when you're dealing with the first movement. Now, the second movement is an andante. It's equally remarkable. It's a perpetual motion movement in steady, I think they're eighth notes, maybe 16th notes. I don't know. I could go look at the score. I did before. I don't remember. But essentially, it's just a totally non-repetitive theme from beginning to end. It's 2.5 minutes long. The rhythm never changes. And every single bar of the main melodic, you hesitate to call it a tune because it's a self-repeating, perpetuating motive that never stops. But every single first note is a trill. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, trill 2, 3, 4, trill 2, 3, 4, trill 2, 3, 4, trill. That's what it is. That's the pattern for the entire movement, with the exception of a brief passage in the middle. But basically, that's what it is. And I'm going to play the whole movement. You got to listen to the whole thing. It's only 2 minutes long and a bit. And it really sounds like one single continuous melody. It does repeat. There is, again, a larger form, A, B, A. It's a very simple form. And I'm going to indicate the moment where A comes back in the second half, so you'll realize it's getting recapitulated, because it can be hard to hear. But that's Haydn's point. The point is he wants to write what sounds like a completely continuous, through composed melody that could go on forever and that never ever actually repeats itself. But it does. And the fact that it does gives you that satisfying feeling of a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a balance to the whole movement, just as we saw in the first movement, that we had continuous development within an overall beautifully symmetrical form. And that's what this symphony is about. It's about continuous development within beautifully symmetrical forms. And Haydn does it in 3 completely different ways. But again, that's another one of those elements that unifies the whole symphony, because the principle behind each movement is the same, and that makes them unique to this symphony and to no other. So let's listen to the entire slow movement. You ready? Here we go. it's just a delicious piece of music. It really, really is. And I think you can see Haydn's point. And the thing that's so marvelous about these pieces is that Haydn is explaining the language of music to us. But he's doing it in a way which is expressive and charming and witty and as enjoyable as possible. I mean, it's music that's explaining itself as it goes, but at the same time conveying feelings and giving you pleasure. I mean, could anything in the universe be better than that? I mean, really, seriously. Now, the finale, again, is in a different form. It's a rondo. Now, rondo is really very simple. It's exactly what the name sounds. It goes around and around and around. It has a theme, which is called a ritornello, and then an episode, and then the ritornello comes back, and then there's another episode, and then the ritornello comes back. That's the usual rondo form. In other words, in letters, it would be A, B, A, C, A. And these can be extended indefinitely. You can go A, B, A, C, A, D, A, E, A, that you can have absolutely monumental psycho rondos. I mean, one of the most demented of all of them is the finale of Mahler's Seventh Symphony, which is so whacked out, has so many sections and things going back and forth that many commentators just throw up their hands and give up trying to understand what the form is, even though it's really basically very simple. So once again, I'm going to play you the entire movement, which is 2.5 minutes, and I'll indicate where the rondo theme is, the A section, and where the B and C, the episodes, are. The thing to know about the main theme is that also has its own micro form, which is ABA, which is very simple, and the A section is a phrase that ends at its highest and most prominent point in a trill. You have the same trill that you had in the first movement and in the slow movement, and its apotheosis occurs in the rondo theme of the finale. Another thing worth keeping in mind about Haydn's rondos particularly is that he used a particular type, often, sometimes not sometimes, but often a variation rondo. In other words, every time the A section comes back, it too gets varied in some way. It may not be complete, because it's an ABA. You don't have to play the whole thing. You just have to sort of hint at it or do a little bit. Then you can go off into another episode. There are many subtle details and things that you can do. And remember that in this symphony, Haydn's intention is to create the impression of continuous development. And so his A sections are going to be varied as well. So you have that feeling of continuous progress. And that's really what you need to know about it. So just listen along, and I'll mark the sections as they occur so you'll know exactly what's happening. You ready? Here we go. Amazing, isn't it? I mean, you know, just beautiful, pellucidly clear. And once again, just as in the first two movements, I can't stress this enough. You have that sense of continuous development within a perfectly well-defined symmetrical form. That, my friends, is what classical style is. It's freedom within structure. It's you know, it's again the Vulcan IDIC, whatever it was, infinite diversity within infinite combinations and perfect formal balance. Haydn had that, and he had it from day one. I just want to emphasize that because we have this view of Haydn, particularly of these early symphonies, being somehow immature, and they're not, as I hope I've just shown you, they're not immature at all. They may be light, they may be sort of, not heavy and serious and extended. They're small scale, but they are perfect little gems of their type and completely mature works by a master who was absolutely confident in his ability to use the language of music of his day to create masterpieces. Small masterpieces, granted, but masterpieces. So that is our discussion of Symphony No. 2. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did, because I have to tell you the truth. In all honesty, I know these pieces and I love them, but in preparing these talks, of course I listen to the whole thing again before I do the talk. That's all my preparation. It's just listening. It's just listening. That's all I do, and that's all you need to do. And then you can talk about it if you want. But you have to listen. And every time I listen, I hear something new and something remarkable. And I'm continuously astonished at just the brilliance and the clarity, just the sheer clarity and lucidity of Haydn's thought, of what he's trying to do, and the simplicity and elegance with which he realizes whatever his goal happens to be. And nothing shows that more clearly than this wonderful 9-minute little Symphony No. 2. So keep on listening, folks. I'm looking forward to Haydn Symphony Crusade No. 3. This is so much fun. I can't even tell you how much fun I'm having. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Bye-bye.